My name is Richard Caldwell. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, reasonable, and easy to work with. I've built a career that doesn't draw attention, a life that looks calm from the outside, and a reputation for not making waves. People tend to assume that means I'm passive, or worse, that I don't notice what's happening around me. That assumption has followed me into every room I've ever entered, including my own home. This story isn't about villains or heroes. It isn't about shouting matches, dramatic exits, or public humiliation. It's about something quieter and in many ways more common. How well-meaning parents can overstep, how families can blur boundaries without realizing it, and how trust between two people can slowly erode. Not because of one explosive betrayal, but because of many small, unchecked intrusions. When people hear that parents were involved in marriage decisions, they often imagine cultural traditions, financial dependence, or outright control. What happened in my life was subtler than that. It looked like advice. It sounded like concern. It arrived disguised as experience and protection. And because it came from family, it was almost impossible to challenge without looking ungrateful or disrespectful. I married someone I loved deeply. We believed we were building a life together. But over time, outside voices began to sit at our table. Quietly at first, then more comfortably. Decisions that should have belonged to the two of us became group discussions. Private disagreements were pre-interpreted by others before we even had the chance to understand them ourselves. Trust didn't shatter all at once. It thinned, it stretched, it grew fragile. I want to be clear about something from the start. This is not a revenge story. I'm not here to expose anyone, punish anyone, or rewrite the past in my favor. What I'm offering is honesty about my own silences, my rationalizations, and the moments I chose peace over clarity because it felt easier at the time. You'll hear how I was perceived as reliable but replaceable, how my calmness was mistaken for consent, and how family interference, never malicious, never loud, slowly rewired the emotional contract between a husband and a wife. You'll also hear how I responded, not with confrontation, but with observation. Not with anger, but with decisions made quietly and deliberately. This story moves slowly on purpose because that's how these things actually happen in real life. No single moment feels big enough to justify drawing a line until one day you realize you've crossed so many small lines that you no longer recognize where you stand. If you're listening to this because you felt invisible in your own relationship, or because you've wondered whether keeping the peace has a hidden cost, I hope you'll stay with me. Not for drama, but for reflection. Before we go any further, let me ask you gently, have you ever looked back and realized that what hurt the most wasn't what was said, but what was quietly decided without you? To understand how everything unfolded, you have to understand who I was to the people around me. Not who I believed I was, but how I functioned in their lives. To my parents-in-law, I was solid. That was the word they used most often. Solid didn't mean impressive. It didn't mean influential. It meant predictable. I showed up on time. I paid bills early. I didn't raise my voice. When decisions needed to be implemented, not debated, I handled them. In family gatherings, I was the one quietly clearing plates while conversations continued over my head. No one asked me to speak because no one expected me to interrupt. To my own parents, I was the son who never caused trouble. They said it with pride, but there was an unspoken assumption behind it. Richard can handle things on his own. Richard doesn't need defending. Richard will adapt. That belief followed me into adulthood, and eventually into my marriage. To my wife, at least in the beginning, I was her partner. We talked for hours when we first met. We laughed easily. We shared plans that felt mutual and balanced. But as time went on, especially after we married, my role began to shift in subtle ways. I became the steady background presence that allowed everything else to move forward smoothly. I was the one who understood when plans changed, the one who didn't mind when others weighed in, the one who would be told gently, "You're so flexible. That's what I love about you." Flexibility, I learned, is often mistaken for permission. At family dinners, decisions about holidays, finances, and even where we would live were discussed as if I were a consultant rather than a stakeholder. Questions were phrased in ways that assumed agreement. "You're okay with that, right?" Always came after the conclusion had already been reached. If I paused, the silence was quickly filled by someone else, usually framed as concern, wisdom, or experience. No one was cruel. That's important to say. There were no insults, no raised voices, no dramatic power plays. Everything happened politely, smilingly, with reassurance. And because of that, it was easy for everyone to believe that nothing was wrong, including me. I told myself that this was what maturity looked like, that compromise was strong, that choosing harmony over ego was part of being a good husband. When something felt off, I minimized it. They mean well. This isn't worth creating tension. It'll balance out later. What I didn't realize then was that balance doesn't happen automatically when one person keeps stepping back. In group settings, I became increasingly invisible. Not ignored exactly, acknowledged just enough to confirm my presence, then passed over. My opinions were met with nods, then gently reshaped by others until they no longer resembled what I had said. If I didn't object, it was taken as agreement. If I did object, rarely, it was treated as confusion. "You're overthinking it. That's not what we meant. This is simpler than you're making it." Over time, I learned that speaking up required more energy than staying quiet. And because I was capable, because I could absorb discomfort without immediate fallout, silence became my default. The irony is that everyone believed they knew me. They described me as calm, logical, and easygoing. And those things were true, but incomplete. Calmness isn't the absence of thought. Logic isn't a lack of feeling. And being easygoing doesn't mean being unaffected. I wasn't invisible because I lacked presence. I was invisible because I was useful without demanding recognition. And in families, usefulness can be more dangerous than weakness. Because when people rely on you to hold things together, they rarely stop to ask what it's costing you. At this stage of the story, nothing had gone wrong yet. No betrayals, no ultimatums, just a quiet reshaping of expectations, a gradual assignment of a role I never formally accepted, but slowly began to inhabit. And once a role is assigned long enough, people forget it was ever a choice. The first moment that stayed with me didn't announce itself as important. At the time, I barely reacted. There was no argument, no visible tension, just a sentence, spoken casually, that landed a little too sharply and never quite left. It happened during a Sunday lunch at my in-laws' house. Nothing formal, just one of those routine gatherings that felt more obligatory than intentional. We were sitting around the table, plates half cleared, conversation drifting between topics that didn't require much attention. At some point, the discussion turned to where my wife and I would spend the upcoming holidays. I had assumed, quietly, privately, that this was something we would decide together later. Not because it was a major issue, but because it felt like ours. We had talked loosely about wanting to alternate years, maybe start a few traditions of our own. Nothing fixed, just ideas. Then my mother-in-law said, "So we've decided you two will come here for Thanksgiving. Christmas, of course, you'll be with your side." She said it kindly, confidently, as if she were confirming a reservation. My wife nodded immediately. "That makes sense," she said. "It's easier that way." I remember looking at her, waiting for her to look back at me. She didn't. Everyone else continued eating, and the conversation was already moving on. No one asked what I thought. No one checked in. The decision had been made, sealed by momentum. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not even hurt. More like disorientation. A brief, quiet thought. Was I supposed to be part of that? I could have spoken up. I knew that even then, it wouldn't have been dramatic to say, "I thought we'd talk about it first." But in that moment, the cost-benefit calculation happened automatically. Saying something would slow things down. It would introduce awkwardness. It would mark me as difficult over something that, on the surface, didn't really matter. So I smiled. I said, "Yeah, that works." That was the first small cut. Not because of the holiday plan itself, but because of how easily my voice was removed from the equation and how quickly I agreed to its removal. On the drive home, I waited again. I thought my wife might mention it. I thought she might say, "Hey, sorry, we should have talked about that." She didn't. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of tires on pavement and the radio playing softly in the background. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that this was normal family stuff, that marriage involved blending systems, not drawing lines. And maybe that was true, to a point. But something subtle had shifted. A precedent had been set. After that, similar moments began to appear, spaced far enough apart that they didn't feel connected at first. A comment about how we should manage our finances, framed as advice but delivered as expectation. A suggestion about where we should live that somehow became a plan before we'd even discussed it privately. Each time the pattern was the same. Discussion elsewhere, decision formed, confirmation requested from me only after alignment had already occurred. And each time I complied. I didn't want to embarrass my wife. I didn't want to challenge her parents in front of others. I didn't want to look rigid or controlling. So I deferred. I told myself that being adaptable was part of love. What I didn't recognize was how these moments were training everyone, including my wife, on what to expect from me. Silence became interpreted as trust, agreement, endorsement. Inside, though, something was being recorded, not as resentment, but as data. I started to notice how often decisions arrived fully formed. How often my role was to adjust, not contribute. How rarely anyone checked in with me unless there was a problem to solve. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't hurt enough to demand attention. But it changed the way I stood in the room. From that point on, I was no longer someone whose input was required, just someone whose compliance was assumed. And once people learn that lesson, they rarely unlearn it on their own. What makes small cuts dangerous isn't their depth, it's their frequency. When something happens once, you question it. When it happens twice, you notice it. When it happens often enough, it becomes the air you breathe. By the second year of our marriage, these moments no longer surprised me. They arrived with the same predictable rhythm as the seasons, always framed as practicality, always delivered with calm certainty. And because nothing exploded, because no one raised their voice or crossed an obvious line, it became easier to accept them as normal. We were looking for a new apartment at the time, a better location, a little more space. My wife and I had spent evenings scrolling through listings together, talking about commute times, light, and noise. I thought we were aligned. Then one night she came home and said, "My dad found a place. It's closer to them, and he thinks it's perfect for us." Again, the words for us did a lot of quiet work. I asked carefully, "Did you like it?" She nodded. "Yeah, and it makes sense financially. He already talked to the landlord." There it was again, that slight lag between decision and disclosure. I hadn't been excluded maliciously. I had simply been bypassed because it was efficient. I went with her to see the place. Her parents were already there, talking through logistics, timelines, and next steps. I asked a few questions. They were answered politely, then rephrased by someone else, as if my curiosity needed translation. When I raised a concern about the commute, it was met with reassurance, not discussion. "You'll get used to it. It's not that bad. This is the smart choice." Smart, sensible, practical. These words became the justification for everything, and I let them be. Part of me genuinely believed I was choosing maturity. I had grown up watching men mistake stubbornness for strength, turn every disagreement into a contest. I didn't want to be that. I told myself that real power was staying calm, seeing the bigger picture, not needing to win. But there's a difference between not needing to win and never being allowed to play. The normalization happened quietly. I stopped expecting to be consulted first. I adjusted my internal timeline. They'll decide, then I'll adapt. I began editing my own reactions before they fully formed. Discomfort became something to manage privately rather than address publicly. What made it harder to recognize was that everyone praised me for it. "You're so understanding," my wife would say. "You're easy to work with," her parents would add. "We're lucky you're not difficult," someone once joked, smiling. They meant it as a compliment. I received it as confirmation that my role had solidified. In group conversations, I spoke less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd learned the outcome wouldn't change. When I did speak, it was often after others had finished, my input framed as a supporting detail rather than a direction. I became the person who smoothed things over, who filled gaps, who absorbed friction so others wouldn't have to. At home, the distance grew in subtler ways. My wife began checking in with her parents before bringing things to me. Not intentionally, not out of disloyalty, but because that had become the pattern. They were the first sounding board. I was the final approver, expected to align. And most of the time I did. I told myself that marriage was about compromise. Those families came with gravity. That this was temporary. That once certain milestones passed, things would recalibrate. They didn't. Instead, the absence of resistance became evidence that everything was fine. No one questioned the arrangement because it worked. Bills were paid, plans moved forward. No visible damage. What they couldn't see, and what I barely admitted to myself, was the internal math I was doing. The way I tracked how often my preferences were postponed, overridden, or quietly ignored. The way trust began to shift, not breaking, but thinning, like fabric worn soft by too much friction. I wasn't angry, I wasn't plotting, I was adapting. But adaptation, when it only moves in one direction, isn't balanced. It's erosion. And by the time I noticed how much ground I'd lost, standing my ground no longer felt natural. It felt disruptive, out of character. That's how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through comfort, through the steady reassurance that nothing is wrong enough to address. Until one day, you realize you've been living in a version of your life where your presence is assumed, but your voice is optional. There's a moment when adaptation turns into identity. It's not dramatic, no one announces it, but suddenly you realize you're no longer choosing how you show up. You're fulfilling a role others have come to rely on. For me, that realization came slowly, through repetition. I was the fixer, the stabilizer, the person everyone trusted to make things work without needing credit or control. When schedules conflicted, I adjusted. When finances were tight, I recalculated. When emotions ran high, I lowered the temperature. I didn't argue facts, I managed outcomes. And because I did it well, the role stuck. In my wife's family, I was introduced not by who I was, but by what I did. Richard will handle it. He's good with that stuff. He doesn't get emotional. These statements weren't insults, they were endorsements, but they also placed me firmly in a supporting position, one step removed from decision-making authority. What I began to notice was that everyone else had a defined lane. Her parents were the advisors. Her siblings were the voices with opinions. My wife was the emotional center. I was the infrastructure, the thing that made everything else function smoothly. Infrastructure isn't consulted, it's expected. Once, during a discussion about a potential job change for my wife, I expressed concern about the timing. We had obligations, commitments we hadn't fully talked through. Her father listened, nodded, then said, "Richard's practical. That's why we appreciate him. But this is about her growth." The conversation moved on. No one challenged my concern directly. They simply reframed it as a personality trait, something to be acknowledged then set aside. Practical, cautious, reliable. Words that softened my objection without addressing it. And my wife didn't push back on that framing. She accepted it, maybe without realizing what it implied, that my perspective was less about partnership and more about temperament. Something to factor in, not necessarily to follow. At home, I started to see the ripple effects. When decisions came up, she'd say things like, "You'll be okay with this, right?" Or, "I know you don't love change, but..." The outcome was already assumed. My role was to confirm my reliability. And I did. Not because I agreed, but because disagreeing felt like stepping out of character. That's the quiet trap of assigned roles. Once people believe they know who you are, any deviation feels like a malfunction. Resistance becomes a surprise. Boundaries feel like betrayal. I wasn't seen as someone with competing priorities. I was seen as someone whose strength was accommodation. And the most unsettling part? I had helped create that image. Every time I stayed silent to keep things smooth, every time I minimized my own discomfort, every time I told myself it wasn't worth the conversation, I reinforced the role. I taught them how to treat me. I trained them to move forward without me. There was no meeting where this was decided. No conversation where I agreed to be secondary in my own marriage. It happened through small, reasonable choices made in isolation, each one defensible, each one seemingly harmless, until they weren't. I began to feel like a guest in decisions that shaped my life, not excluded exactly, just late. Always brought in after the important alignment had already occurred. My job was to adapt the plan to reality, not shape the plan itself. And because I was good at adapting, no one questioned whether I should have been involved sooner. That's when I understood something critical. Roles, once assigned, are rarely revoked voluntarily. They persist until they become inconvenient, or until the person playing them stops. At that point, I still believed the solution was patience. That if I continued to show up consistently, trust would recalibrate. That eventually, my steadiness would earn me more say, not less. I was wrong, because the role I was playing didn't lead to a partnership. It led to invisibility. And invisibility, when sustained long enough, doesn't provoke conflict. It provokes change, quiet change. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic turning point that anyone else could point to later and say, "That's when things changed." It happened on an ordinary weekday evening. I came home later than usual, tired but not upset, carrying the low-grade fatigue that comes from weeks of unspoken compromises. My wife was in the kitchen, phone in hand, smiling faintly at something on the screen. She looked up and said, almost casually, "Oh, just so you know, we're going to delay our trip next month. My parents think it's better if we wait." She said we, but she meant you'll adjust. I stood there, keys still in my hand, and felt something inside me go very still. Not tense, not angry, just quiet, as if a switch had been flipped from noise to clarity. I asked calmly, "When did we talk about that?" She hesitated, just for a second. "Well, we didn't really. It came up earlier today." "With them," I said, not accusing, just stating a fact. She nodded. "Yeah, they had some good points. In the past, this is where I would have weighed the situation, chosen the least disruptive response, and moved on. I would have said okay and found a way to make it work. I would have told myself that plans change, that flexibility is part of adulthood. But something was different. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't surprised. I was done being confused. For the first time, I saw the pattern clearly, not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a system. Decisions were being formed elsewhere, validated by authority, and delivered to me as updates. My role wasn't a partner, it was an adapter. And suddenly, I understood that no amount of patience would change that. I said, "I wish we had talked about it together first." She looked relieved. "I knew you'd understand." That sentence landed harder than anything else she could have said, because it confirmed what I had suspected for a long time. My understanding had become predictable, reliable, automatic. It wasn't something she valued, it was something she depended on. I didn't argue. I didn't explain further. I just nodded and went to put my things away. The conversation ended there, not because it was resolved, but because there was nothing left to say in that moment. That night, lying awake, I replayed years of similar exchanges: the holidays, the apartment, the finances, the job decisions. All of it fit together in a way it never had before. And with that clarity came an unexpected calm. I stopped asking myself whether I was overreacting. I stopped wondering if I was being unfair. The emotional fog lifted, replaced by a simple truth. I was in a marriage where my consent was assumed, not sought. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. The next day, nothing changed on the surface. I went to work, I answered emails, I made dinner, I listened, I responded appropriately. Anyone watching would have seen the same calm, dependable Richard they always had. But internally, a line had been drawn. Not against my wife, not against her parents, against the version of myself who kept hoping that silence would eventually be understood as sacrifice. From that day on, I stopped expecting acknowledgement. I stopped waiting for things to improve on their own. I stopped interpreting neglect as misunderstanding. Instead, I began observing, carefully, quietly, without judgment. I paid attention to who spoke to whom first, to see how information flowed, to whose opinions carried weight and whose were translated, softened, or ignored. I noticed how often my wife sought reassurance from others before bringing things to me, and how rarely she noticed that pattern. This wasn't about punishment, it wasn't about revenge. It was about alignment. If I was going to continue living this life, I needed to understand it fully, without illusion, without hope filling in the gaps where respect should have been. That night marked this end of my confusion, and the beginning of my choice. After that evening, my silence changed its meaning. Before, it had been reactive, an attempt to keep things smooth, to avoid unnecessary tension, to prove that I was reasonable. Now it was deliberate, observational, strategic. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't need to. Outwardly, nothing about me seemed different. I still listened. I still nodded. I still agreed when agreement was expected. But internally, I stopped participating emotionally in decisions that didn't include me from the start. This wasn't withdrawal, it was recalibration. I stopped volunteering opinions unless they were explicitly requested, and even then I offered them without attachment. I stopped filling silences that weren't mine to fill. When plans were presented as conclusions, I acknowledged them without endorsement. Okay, I would say. I hear you. Neutral words, accurate words. People interpreted this as maturity. Her parents, especially, seemed pleased. I was handling things well. I was being supportive. There was a sense of relief in their interactions with me, as if they had been bracing for resistance that never came. They mistook my stillness for surrender. My wife noticed something, though she couldn't quite name it. She'd ask, "Are you okay?" And I'd answer honestly, yes, because I was. Not content, but clear. There's a difference. What she didn't ask, and what I didn't offer, was why things felt different. Because explaining would have required her to confront a pattern she wasn't ready to see. And I wasn't interested in forcing awareness. Awareness, when forced, often turns into defensiveness. Instead, I focused on myself. I reviewed our finances more closely, not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted to understand exactly where I stood. I looked at timelines, at obligations, at contingencies. I noticed how intertwined certain decisions had become and where they weren't. I began documenting things, conversations, dates, agreements, not obsessively, not emotionally, methodically, like someone preparing for clarity, not conflict. At the same time, I became more selective about my energy. I stopped overfunctioning. If something wasn't mine to manage, I didn't step in automatically. If a plan needed coordination and I hadn't been part of its creation, I let others handle the logistics. This created small delays, minor inconveniences, nothing dramatic, just enough friction to reveal who had been relying on my quiet labor. No one confronted me about it. They adjusted, and that told me everything I needed to know. Silence, when chosen consciously, has weight. It creates space, and in that space, systems reveal themselves. I saw how quickly others filled the gaps I left behind, how decisions moved forward without my involvement when my effort wasn't freely available. How little curiosity there was about my internal state as long as outcomes remained acceptable. That observation didn't hurt. It confirmed my understanding. My wife, sensing distance, began sharing more updates after the fact. She'd say, "I should have told you earlier," or "We didn't think it was a big deal." And I'd respond calmly, "Okay," not passive-aggressively, just neutrally. She wasn't used to that neutrality. She had grown accustomed to reassurance, to engagement, to my quiet emotional labor smoothing the edges. Without it, she felt uncertain, but not enough to change the process, just enough to feel slightly off balance. And still, I didn't confront her, because confrontation would have centered emotion. I was centered. I was learning how power moved in our relationship, not overt power, but functional power. Who influenced decisions? Who validated them? Who absorbed their consequences? And once I understood that, I understood my position clearly. Silence had become a boundary, not a wall, not a weapon, a line I would no longer cross for free. Others continued as if nothing had changed. They believed the system was intact because it was still producing results. They didn't realize that the person holding it together had stopped doing so emotionally and was now simply watching it operate. That's the danger of underestimating quiet people. When they stop reacting, it's not because they've given up, it's because they've already moved to the next phase. What they never noticed was that while I had stopped participating emotionally, I had become more attentive than ever. No arguments, not to grievances, but to patterns. I paid attention to how information moved through the family. Who initiated conversations? Who framed the decisions? Who was consulted first and who was informed last? I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was mapping influence. At work, this kind of analysis was second nature to me. I managed complex projects by understanding dependencies, not by controlling people. I knew that outcomes weren't determined by authority alone, but by flow of data, of trust, of accountability. So I applied the same lens to my own life. I noticed that my wife rarely brought decisions to me until they were already emotionally settled elsewhere. Her parents didn't demand control, they offered certainty. They spoke early, confidently, and framed their input as protection. By the time she came to me, the emotional work had already been done. All that remained was implementation. And I was very good at implementation. I began to see how often my calm demeanor had been used as a stabilizer, not just for my wife, but for her entire family system. I absorbed uncertainty so others wouldn't have to. I made outcomes predictable. I removed friction. But no one was tracking what I needed in return. So I started tracking it myself. I organized documents, nothing secretive, nothing unethical, just clarity. I reviewed legal structures around our shared assets. I looked at timelines and obligations. I revisited conversations from months, even years earlier, and noted how often my consent had been assumed rather than explicitly requested. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building a case for myself. At the same time, I invested in quiet competence. I took additional certifications at work. I strengthened professional relationships that didn't intersect with my wife's social or family circle. I expanded my options without announcing them. Not as an escape plan, at least not yet, as insurance. What surprised me most was how invisible this preparation was to everyone else. Because I wasn't acting out, no one suspected anything was changing. There were no red flags, no emotional volatility, no ultimatums. To them, I was still Richard, the calm one, the reasonable one, the man who didn't make things complicated. They didn't notice that I had stopped asking for approval, that I had stopped needing validation, that I was no longer emotionally invested in being understood. And because they didn't notice, they didn't adjust. That's an important point. Systems only change when pressure is applied, and I had removed myself as a source of pressure entirely. I also began to notice something else, something quieter, more uncomfortable. My wife didn't ask me how I felt anymore. She asked if I was okay, if things were fine. Binary questions with limited emotional depth. Questions designed to confirm stability, not explore connection. And I answered them truthfully. Yes, I was okay, because I had stopped expecting intimacy where there was only coordination. That realization hurt, not sharply, but deeply, like recognizing a long-term injury you'd been compensating for without realizing it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Still, I didn't blame her. She was operating within a system that rewarded alignment with authority and punished deviation with anxiety. She wasn't malicious, she was conditioned, and I had helped condition her. That understanding softened something in me. It removed the need for anger. This wasn't a battle to win, it was a structure to exit or redefine. As weeks passed, I became more intentional with my time. I spent more evenings alone, not in avoidance, but in reflection. I wrote, not about grievances, but about values. What I needed to feel like a partner again. what I would no longer accept as normal. I noticed that my absence from emotional labor created subtle discomfort around me. Conversations felt less smooth. Decisions took longer. There was more checking in with others, more reassurance seeking, but no one connected it to me. That's the paradox of quiet dominance. When you've been holding things together silently, your withdrawal doesn't look like power. It looks like an absence. An absence is easy to misinterpret until the consequences accumulate. By then, I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement. I was preparing for resolution. Not a dramatic one, a clean one that honored my values, my boundaries, and the version of myself I had allowed to shrink for too long. They never noticed the shift because they were focused on outcomes. I was focused on ownership. And once you reclaim ownership of your life, everything else becomes negotiable or unnecessary. The reveal wasn't a discovery in the traditional sense. There was no hidden document, no secret conversation overheard, no single piece of information that suddenly changed everything. It was an internal reveal, a moment when understanding solidified into certainty. I was sitting alone one evening, reviewing our shared calendar, something I'd done hundreds of times before. But this time, I wasn't looking at logistics. I was looking at patterns. How often have plans involving my wife's family appeared without prior discussion? How rarely anything was blocked off as ours unless I initiated it. And that's when it became undeniable. I wasn't just being excluded from decisions. I was being managed. Not maliciously, not consciously, but systematically. The marriage had quietly shifted from a partnership to a coordination role, where my function was to support decisions validated elsewhere. The authority structure was clear, even if no one would ever admit it out loud. Emotional legitimacy flowed upward to her parents. Practical execution flowed downward to me. Once I saw that, I stopped asking why. I started asking what this meant. What it meant was that no amount of improved communication would fix the imbalance. Because the imbalance wasn't caused by misunderstanding, it was caused by misplaced loyalty and unchallenged influence. And what it meant, most importantly, was that I had leverage I hadn't acknowledged before. Not over them, over myself. I realized that I was the stabilizing force in the system, the one who made it all function without friction, the one who absorbed the consequences of decisions made by others, the one who turned plans into reality. If I removed myself, not emotionally but structurally, the entire dynamic would change. That was the leverage. Not money, not secrets, not threats. Choice. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel powerful. I felt calm, grounded, like someone who had finally located the load-bearing wall in a building and understood why everything felt heavier on one side. That night, I wrote a list. Not of grievances, but of non-negotiables. Things I needed in order to continue in the marriage with integrity, not demands, conditions. Mutual decision-making. Clear boundaries with extended family, privacy and disagreement, respect that didn't require constant accommodation to earn. I also wrote a second list, the things I was no longer willing to provide unconditionally: automatic agreement, emotional buffering, logistical rescue, silence in the face of erasure. Seeing it on paper changed something. It wasn't abstract anymore, it was actionable. I didn't share the lists, not yet, because this wasn't about issuing ultimatums. It was about understanding whether alignment was still possible or whether I was the only one invested in it. I watched closely in the days that followed, not for apologies, but for curiosity, for initiative, for any sign that my wife noticed the emotional distance and wanted to understand it, not just smooth it over. What I saw instead was discomfort without inquiry. She sensed something was off, but treated it like a temporary mood, something that would pass if left undisturbed. She received reassurance from her parents, sought confirmation that everything was okay, that the system was intact. It was, but I was no longer inside it the way I had been before. That was the quietest part of the reveal, realizing that I had already stepped outside emotionally and no one had noticed. There was grief in that, a private grief, for the version of the relationship I had believed in. For the future, I had imagined and assumed equal footing. But grief didn't paralyze me. It clarified me. I understood then that staying silent forever wasn't an option. Silence had been useful for observation, but it wasn't a long-term strategy. At some point, choice had to turn into action. Not an impulsive action, decisive action. And that action wouldn't be about forcing others to change. It would be about deciding what I would do if they didn't. That's the kind of leverage no one can take from you. And once you recognize it, the path forward narrows quickly. You stop asking what you should do. You start asking what you're willing to live with. Once clarity settles in, indecision becomes impossible to maintain. I reached a point where continuing as before felt dishonest. Not just to myself, but to the idea of marriage I claimed to believe in. I wasn't angry enough to explode, and I wasn't broken enough to collapse. I was simply unwilling to keep participating in a structure that required my erasure to function. That's what made this moment difficult. There was no crisis forcing my hand. No betrayal is dramatic enough to justify action in the eyes of others. Everything still looked fine. But fine had become intolerable. I laid out the options carefully, the way I did with complex projects at work. Not emotionally, logically. The first option was to continue adapting, to accept that this was the role I'd been assigned and make peace with it. To treat the marriage as a cooperative arrangement rather than an intimate partnership. To lower my expectations and preserve stability. I knew I could do that. I had been doing it, but I also knew what it would cost me over time. Resentment I wouldn't express, intimacy I wouldn't feel, and a slow erosion of self-respect, stability at the expense of integrity. That option was no longer viable. The second option was confrontation. A direct conversation where I laid everything out, every instance, every pattern, every boundary crossed. I imagined it clearly, the defensiveness, the explanations, the tears, the promises to do better. And then I imagined what would happen after. Best case, there would be a temporary adjustment, more inclusion, more checking in. But unless the underlying authority structure changed, unless my wife recentered our marriage as the primary decision-making unit, those changes would fade. Habits reinforced over the years don't dissolve under pressure. They resurface once vigilance relaxes. Confrontation might create awareness. It wouldn't create independence. The third option was distance. Emotional, practical, and eventually structural. Not as punishment, but as truth. To stop compensating, to stop enabling, to see whether the system could recalibrate on its own when my stabilizing presence was no longer available. This option felt irreversible, not because it guaranteed separation, but because it removed illusion. Once you stop holding something together, you find out very quickly whether it can stand. That was the option I chose. Not dramatically, not overnight, quietly. I didn't announce a turning point. I didn't frame it as a test. I simply began living as if my needs mattered as much as everyone else's. I made decisions independently when they affected me. I declined plans that were presented without consultation. I stopped rearranging my schedule to accommodate last-minute expectations. When asked to just go along with it, I said, "I'm not comfortable with that," calmly, without explanation. The effect was immediate and unsettling. My wife was confused, not angry, confused. She asked what was going on. I told her the truth, in the simplest terms possible. I don't feel like an equal partner in our decisions. She assured me that wasn't her intention. that she valued me, that she loved me. I believed her. But intention doesn't override impact. And love without boundaries becomes management. I didn't escalate the conversation. I didn't list examples. I didn't argue. I just stated what I needed going forward and what I would no longer do. That was the irreversible part. Because once you name your boundaries and enforce them calmly, you can't go back to pretending you didn't see the problem. From that moment on, the relationship entered a new phase, not of conflict, but of exposure. Every interaction revealed whether my presence was desired as a partner or tolerated as a function. There was no drama, no raised voices, just a growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted and that not everyone was prepared to adjust. I wasn't asking anyone to choose sides. I was choosing myself, and that choice, once made, carries a quiet finality. After the decision point, I didn't speed up. I slowed down. That may sound counterintuitive, but once you commit internally, there's no need for urgency. Urgency creates noise. Noise invites resistance. Silence, on the other hand, allows things to unfold naturally and truthfully. I began taking practical steps that aligned with the boundaries I'd named, not secretly, not deceptively, just independently. I separated responsibilities that had previously been shared by default. I adjusted my finances so that my personal obligations were clear, contained, and fully within my control. Nothing hidden, nothing unethical, just clean lines where there had once been blur. At work, I accepted a role expansion I had been postponing. It required more travel, more autonomy, and less flexibility for last-minute family expectations. I informed my wife, not as a negotiation, but as information. "This is happening," I said. "I wanted you to know." She nodded, processing. There were questions, but no objections. That, too, told me something. At home, I became more deliberate with my time. I no longer rearranged plans to accommodate decisions I hadn't been part of. If a family gathering conflicted with something I had already committed to, I didn't cancel. I wished them well and stayed with my plan. There was no anger in it, no edge, just consistency. Her parents noticed first, not in words, but in tone. There were pauses where there hadn't been before, a slight recalibration in how they spoke to me. I was no longer assumed. I was uncertain. They didn't confront me. They didn't ask what had changed. They simply adjusted their expectations downward, the way people do when a resource becomes less reliable. And that's exactly what had happened. I had stopped being a resource. My wife, caught in the middle, tried to smooth things over. She'd say, "He's just busy lately," or "Things are hectic right now." Explanations designed to preserve the illusion that nothing fundamental had shifted. But something had. I no longer provided emotional buffering. If she was stressed about family tension, I listened, but I didn't fix it. If she was frustrated by conflicting expectations, I didn't absorb them on her behalf. I stayed present without being responsible. That distinction was new to her and uncomfortable. She asked more questions, tentative ones. "Are we okay? Do you still want this?" Questions searching for reassurance rather than understanding. I answered honestly. "I want a partnership," I said. "I can't keep doing this version of things." I didn't argue when she became defensive. I didn't soothe when she became anxious. I stayed steady. And because I stayed steady, the system around us began to wobble. Not collapse, wobble. Plans took longer to finalize. Decisions required more coordination. There were moments of visible frustration when things didn't align as smoothly as they used to. No one blamed me directly. They couldn't. I hadn't done anything wrong. I was simply no longer compensating. That's the part people don't anticipate. They think power comes from control, from demands, from confrontation. But real leverage comes from withdrawing what you've been giving away for free and doing it without bitterness. I didn't announce my boundaries repeatedly. I lived them. I didn't demand recognition. I let absence speak. By the time anyone realized that something serious was happening, the momentum had already shifted. The old dynamic required my cooperation to function, and that cooperation was no longer guaranteed. Still, there was no explosion, just a quiet accumulation of consequences. And in that space, everyone began to feel the weight of decisions they had once made lightly. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do when change is quiet. They arrived in fragments, in small moments of friction that no one could quite trace back to a single cause. At first, it showed up as confusion. Plans that used to come together effortlessly began to stall. Conversations circled without landing. My wife's parents would suggest something, pause, then ask, "Does that work for everyone?" A question they'd rarely asked before. The tone wasn't deferential. It was uncertain. They were feeling the absence of something they couldn't name. My wife felt it more acutely. She started to notice that decisions carried more emotional weight than before. Where there had once been reassurance, my steady presence smoothing out discomfort, there was now neutrality. I listened, but I didn't reassure. I acknowledged, but I didn't resolve. This unsettled her. She'd say I feel like we're disconnected lately. And I wouldn't argue. I'd say, I can understand why it feels that way. I didn't rush to close the gap, because closing it prematurely would have meant returning to the same imbalance. What she was experiencing wasn't abandonment, it was symmetry. For the first time, she was sitting with uncertainty without me absorbing it for her. She was fielding expectations from her parents without my quiet compliance backing them up, and she didn't like how exposed it felt. Neither did they. There were subtle shifts in how her parents interacted with her. More pressure, more urgency, less confidence that things would just work out. The system they relied on, where advice flowed freely and outcomes aligned smoothly, was faltering, and they didn't understand why. They never connected it to the man who used to nod quietly at the end of the table. Because from their perspective, I hadn't changed dramatically. I was still polite, still present, still calm. I hadn't accused them of overstepping. I hadn't demanded space. I had simply stopped making their influence invisible. That's when discomfort turned into concern. My wife began to feel caught between two realities. One where her parents' involvement had always felt safe and supportive, and another where her marriage felt increasingly fragile. The tension between those two worlds became harder to ignore. She tried to bridge it the only way she knew how, by asking me to reassure her again. "Can you just tell me we're okay?" she asked one evening, her voice tired. I looked at her and said gently, "I want us to be okay. But we can't be okay if I don't feel like I matter." There was no accusation in it, no raised voice, just truth. She didn't respond right away. That silence, the one she didn't fill, told me the consequences had fully arrived. Because now the cost of the old dynamic was no longer abstract. It had a name, a shape, a presence in the room. Her parents, sensing instability, increased their involvement, not maliciously, but reflexively. More check-ins, more advice, more reassurance was offered to her. And unintentionally, that only deepened the divide. The more they leaned in, the clearer it became that the marriage itself had never been fully protected from outside influence. It had been buffered by me. Without that buffer, the imbalance was exposed. I didn't celebrate that realization. There was no satisfaction in being right, only a quiet sadness that it had taken absence for truth to surface. Still, I didn't intervene. This wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about letting reality assert itself. And reality has a way of clarifying priorities when nothing else does. By the time anyone acknowledged that something was truly wrong, the emotional distance had already done its work. Trust hadn't been destroyed in an explosion. It had thinned to the point where it could no longer carry weight. The consequences were no longer coming. They were here, and there was no way to pretend otherwise. There's a moment when concern turns into panic. Not loud panic, quiet, searching panic, the kind that shows up as overcorrection, as sudden willingness, as promises made too quickly. That moment came after the consequences had settled in long enough for everyone to feel them, but not long enough for anyone to understand how permanent they were. My wife began suggesting conversations, real ones. She asked if we could reset, if we could talk things through properly without distractions. She offered compromises that would have felt meaningful months earlier. She even suggested clearer boundaries with her parents. I listened, and for the first time I heard effort, but I also heard fear. The urgency wasn't about partnership, it was about loss. That distinction matters. Because when change is driven by fear of losing stability rather than commitment to equality, it rarely lasts. I told her the truth. Not all at once, not as an indictment. I told her that I had been asking for a partnership for a long time, just not out loud. That my silence had been misread as consent. That by the time I spoke, something in me had already shifted. She cried. Not dramatically, quietly. The way people do when they realize they've been responding to symptoms instead of causes. She asked why I hadn't said something sooner. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, because every time I tried, it felt like the conversation had already happened somewhere else. That landed. For a while, she pulled back from her parents. She delayed sharing things. She tried to make decisions with me first. The effort was real. I could see that. But it felt rehearsed. Not insincere, just unfamiliar, like someone learning a new language under pressure. And underneath it, the old reflexes were still there. The instinct to seek validation from authority. The comfort of external reassurance. The gravitational pull of a system she had never questioned before. We both felt it. She was trying to rebuild trust. I was assessing whether trust could still carry weight. There were moments, brief, hopeful ones, where it felt possible, where conversation flowed more evenly, where decisions were actually shared, where I could glimpse the partnership we once believed we had. But those moments were fragile. They required constant effort from her and constant restraint from me. They existed only in the absence of stress. The moment pressure returned from family expectations, from uncertainty, from fear, the old patterns resurfaced. And I knew then this wasn't a problem of intention. It was a problem of foundation. You can't retrofit equality into a structure built on deference. You can't protect a marriage retroactively if it was never clearly defined as the primary unit. By the time she was ready to defend the boundary had already cost too much to re-erect. That was the hardest part to accept, because on the surface it looked fixable. There were apologies, adjustments, promises. But beneath it, the trust I needed, the trust that my voice would matter before alignment occurred, was gone. I wasn't angry at her parents. I wasn't even angry at her. I was grieving the realization that timing matters as much as intent. When someone asks you to stay after you've already learned how to leave internally, they're asking for something they don't understand. By the time everyone wanted to fix it, the version of me who needed fixing was no longer there. And no amount of effort can reach someone who has already stepped out of the role you depended on. That's not punishment. That's a consequence. The final confrontation didn't look like what most people imagine when they hear that word. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic declarations meant to wound. It was quiet, measured, almost gentle. We sat at the dining table one evening, long after dinner had gone cold. There was no script. No list of grievances was laid out between us. Just two people facing the truth they had both been circling for months. My wife spoke first. She said she felt like she was losing me, that she hadn't realized how much she had leaned on her parents until she felt the distance grow between us. She said she was scared. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her I wasn't angry. And that was true. Anger would have implied expectation, hope, a belief that something could still be forced into alignment. What I felt instead was clarity. I told her that I didn't doubt her love, that I believed she had never intended to sideline me. But intention, I said, wasn't the issue anymore. The issue was that I no longer trusted the structure of our marriage to protect our partnership when pressure came from outside. She asked if I was saying I wanted to leave. I said, I'm saying I can't stay in a relationship where my role is conditional on my silence. There was a long pause. She asked what I needed in order to stay. That was the question she should have asked years earlier, and I answered it honestly. I needed decisions to start with us, not be filtered through others first. I needed boundaries that didn't require constant enforcement. I needed to know that when opinions conflicted, my voice wouldn't be translated or softened to keep the peace. I needed to feel chosen, not managed. She listened. She nodded. She said she understood. And I believed that she did. But understanding isn't the same as readiness. I could see it in her face. The fear of disappointing her parents, the anxiety of stepping out of a familiar system, the weight of redefining loyalty. Those weren't things she could resolve with good intentions alone. They required a rupture she wasn't prepared to make, and I wasn't prepared to wait for. I told her that even if she tried, even if she changed, I didn't know if I could rebuild the trust that had been worn away quietly over time. That wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. She cried then, softly, without theatrics. I didn't comfort her the way I once would have. Not because I didn't care, but because that version of comfort had been part of the imbalance. I stayed present. I stayed kind. I stayed firm. We talked logistics, calmly, like two people acknowledging that love doesn't automatically mean compatibility. There was no winner in that conversation, but there was dignity. When it ended, we both knew what would happen next, even if neither of us said it out loud. That confrontation didn't burn bridges. It clarified them, and clarity, once achieved, doesn't fade. Who I am now isn't defined by what I lost. It's defined by what I no longer give away unconsciously. After everything settled, after the conversations, the logistics, the quiet separation of lives that once ran in parallel, I expected to feel something dramatic: relief, emptiness, regret, maybe even anger. What I felt instead was steadiness. Not happiness in the conventional sense, but alignment. For the first time in years, my internal state matched my external behavior. There was no performance to maintain, no role to fulfill to keep others comfortable. I made decisions without rehearsing how they would be received by people who weren't living my life. That freedom didn't come from leaving a marriage. It came from reclaiming authorship. I still value calm. I still avoid unnecessary conflict, but now those qualities are choices, not reflexes. They serve me rather than erase me. I'm more selective about where I invest emotional labor. I notice when people assume rather than ask, when systems quietly rely on my adaptability without offering reciprocity, and when I see that pattern forming, I don't explain myself into exhaustion. I step back. That's something I never used to do. I've also learned that being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. When people believe you're harmless, they reveal themselves. When they assume you'll adjust, they expose their expectations. Quiet observation has taught me more than confrontation ever did. I don't see my former wife as an antagonist. I see her as someone shaped by a system she never thought to question until it was too late. I wish her well, genuinely. But wishing someone well doesn't require staying where you disappear. That distinction matters. My relationship with my own family has changed too. I speak more directly now. I don't rush to smooth things over. When something doesn't sit right, I name it early, before patterns form, before silence turns into precedent. I've learned that boundaries aren't walls. They're orientation markers. They tell people how to approach you and tell you when to step away. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can walk away from situations that cost you your voice. Not dramatically, not angrily, just decisively. That confidence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. People notice it anyway. And here's the part that surprised me most. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. I didn't lose empathy. I gained discernment. I didn't retreat from connection. I learned how to require mutuality. The man I was before wasn't weak. He was patient, capable, well-intentioned. But he believed that endurance was the same as strength. I know better now. Strength is choosing not to participate in systems that only function when you shrink. Strength is walking away without needing the other side to fully understand. Strength is letting silence do its work and then deciding what comes next. I don't tell this story to warn people away from family or marriage or compromise. I tell it because quiet erosion is easy to miss when you're the one absorbing it. And because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining and start living in a way that reflects what you know to be true. There's no dramatic ending to this story. No moment where everyone suddenly understands. No scene where the right words fix what time quietly dismantled. And that's intentional, because real life rarely offers clean redemption arcs. What it offers instead is clarity, if you're willing to sit with it long enough. Looking back, I don't regret being patient. I don't regret trying to keep the peace. Those choices came from good intentions, from a belief in love, cooperation, and restraint. They weren't mistakes. What I regret is confusing silence with strength for too long. When families get involved in marriages, it's rarely out of malice. It comes from care, from habit, from the comfort of familiarity. But when those voices aren't clearly bounded, they don't just influence decisions. They replace intimacy. Slowly, politely, almost invisibly. Trust between two people doesn't usually collapse because of betrayal. It collapses because of delegation. When emotional decisions are made elsewhere, when alignment happens before conversation, when one partner adapts so well that no one notices what it costs, the relationship changes shape. And if that shape isn't questioned early, it hardens. The lesson I carry forward isn't don't compromise or cut people off. It's simpler and harder than that. If you have to shrink to keep the peace isn't real. If your understanding is assumed instead of earned, it will eventually be taken for granted. And if you're always brought in after decisions are made, you're not being trusted. You're being managed. Quiet people are often told they're strong because they don't complain, because they don't escalate, because they can handle it. But handling everything alone isn't resilience. It's isolation with good manners. Real partnership requires friction, not conflict, but the willingness to slow things down to tolerate discomfort long enough for mutual respect to form. By the time I understood that, it was too late to rebuild what had already eroded. But it wasn't too late to stop the erosion from continuing. That's the quiet dominance in this story. Not winning, not proving anyone wrong, not being seen as the hero, but choosing not to disappear anymore. If you're listening to this and recognizing parts of your own life whether in marriage, family, or any relationship where your voice has become optional. I hope you don't wait as long as I did to ask the hard questions. Not loudly, not dramatically, but honestly. Because the cost of silence is always paid later, and usually in ways you can't reverse. I'll leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. At what point does keeping the peace stop being kindness and start becoming self-erasure?